The sky was pink champagne.
On June 6, 1996, when a deeply distraught mother named Darlie Routier frantically pleaded for immediate help after discovering her young sons, the 6-year-old Devon and the 5-year-old Damon had been brutally stabbed in their North Texas home's spacious living room. The emergency operator struggled immensely to calm the hysterical Darlie and gather crucial details about the situation. But in her overwhelming state of shock and trauma, she could only repeat her desperate cries for assistance over and over again, her voice filled with raw panic and disbelief. Authorities, including local police officers and emergency responders, rushed to the scene as quickly as possible, only to confront what they would later describe as an absolute bloodbath, with blood splattered across furniture, floors, and walls in a chaotic manner. Paramedics hurriedly entered the family room, which was the apparent site of the violent assault, and there they located the heartbreaking cause of the emergency summons. The two innocent youngsters, 6-year-old Devon and 5-year-old Damon, had been pierced multiple times in their upper bodies and lower limbs, gradually losing their lives through massive blood loss that soaked the carpet around them. The 6-year-old Devon, with his severe wounds including multiple stabs to the chest that penetrated vital organs, was tragically pronounced dead right there on site, prompting the medics to urgently redirect all their efforts toward the 5-year-old Damon, who miraculously still maintained a faint hold on survival despite his critical condition. Despite the paramedics' desperate and repeated efforts to administer cardiopulmonary resuscitation, it soon became painfully evident that Damon's respiratory organs, specifically his lungs, had been perforated in the course of the vicious violence, leading to internal bleeding that could not be controlled. He succumbed to his injuries later that same evening at the hospital, leaving the family devastated beyond words. Now that both children had tragically passed away, officials from the Rowlett Police Department shifted their intense scrutiny to the sole identified observer of the horrific incident, Darlie herself, who claimed she had been harmed by the identical trespasser responsible for her offspring's demise. Allegedly injured with slashes to her neck, arm, and shoulder by the same intruder who killed her children, Darlie narrated the night's terrifying occurrences while recuperating in her medical facility bed, providing a detailed account that would become central to the investigation. Unbeknownst to the authorities at that initial point, by carefully documenting her account and beginning their probe, they were venturing into what would evolve into one of the most thorough, resource-intensive, and highly divisive murder investigations in the entire annals of Texas law enforcement history, a probe whose conclusions would face relentless examination, legal challenges, and public contention for generations ahead, sparking debates about innocence, guilt, and justice system flaws. Authorities, determined to preserve the integrity of the site, maintained a continuous 24-hour surveillance at the incident location to prevent tampering, with seasoned detectives planning to resume their meticulous search come early Friday morning, seeking any overlooked traces or clues that could potentially aid in unraveling this savage dual slaying that shocked the quiet suburban community. Reporting live from the chaotic scene in Rowlett was Jay Gray of Texas News 5, who provided initial updates to a horrified public tuning in for details. For numerous individuals across Texas and beyond, Darlie's entire existence would ultimately be reduced and oversimplified to just those fateful initial hours on the morning of June 6, 1996, overshadowing her previous life. In her 26 years before the unimaginable tragedy struck, Darlie was widely regarded as the epitome of a classic Southern belle, charming, kind-hearted, and vivacious, with a bubbly personality that endeared her to friends and neighbors alike. She first encountered her future spouse, Darlie Routier, at the tender age of 15, while he was 17, at a bustling Western sizzlin' eatery where her mother was employed as a staff member, marking the beginning of a whirlwind teenage romance. They swiftly developed a deep and passionate affection for one another, leading them to tie the knot 4 years afterward in an intimate ceremony held at Darren's family dwelling, surrounded by loved ones who celebrated their young love. Subsequently, circumstances appeared to advance positively and progressively for the youthful pair, who embraced married life with enthusiasm. Darren, an ambitious entrepreneur, initiated his own venture in the electronics industry, specializing in circuit board testing for companies, which rapidly flourished due to his hard work and business acumen, enabling him to earn a respectable livelihood that would expand considerably in the ensuing period, providing financial stability for their growing family. By 1995, just a year before the tragedy, his enterprise had impressively generated gross revenues of $500,000, resulting in his personal take-home earnings of $125,000 annually, a substantial sum that translates to approximately $260,000 in contemporary US dollars when adjusted for inflation, placing them comfortably in the upper echelons of income. The funds were accumulating at a brisk and exciting pace, yet it appeared the Routier were dispersing them at an even quicker rate, enjoying the fruits of their success without restraint. As a youthful duo in their 20s falling into the uppermost 2% income tier for their demographic, they splurged on every whim that captured their fancy, indulging in luxuries that reflected their newfound wealth, from Darren's sleek 1982 Jaguar, sports car used for commuting to work, to an extravagant $800 memorial marker for Darlie's beloved deceased feline, showcasing their affectionate and sometimes impulsive spending habits. The Routier home itself became a hub of joy and activity, affectionately dubbed the Nintendo House by neighborhood kids who flocked there, drawn to its elaborate entertainment area equipped with the latest video games and consoles, treating it as their go-to community gathering place for fun and playdates. You might initially assume the Routiers were merely extravagant or ostentatious in their displays of wealth. They were equally recognized throughout the community for their genuine benevolence and warmth toward others. Residents in the area often mentioned and appreciated how Darlie would thoughtfully deliver prepared dishes and homemade sustenance to households dealing with illness or loss on their block, including a particularly memorable instance where she generously covered a neighbor's housing loan installment during their grueling battle with malignancy, demonstrating her compassionate nature. Caregivers in the neighborhood routinely and confidently dispatched their offspring to the Routier residence for recreational time and playdates, secure in the knowledge that their little ones would receive excellent supervision and care under Darlie and her household's watchful eyes. It marked an era of prosperity and contentment for the Routier, where they enjoyed widespread admiration from friends and neighbors, monetary ease that allowed for a comfortable lifestyle, and an overall aura of dependability and family stability that seemed unbreakable. However, they remained completely oblivious to the impending and catastrophic collapse of the existence they had labored so diligently to construct over the years, as underlying pressures began to mount unnoticed. Entering the early months of 1996, Routiers found themselves grappling with increasing financial strain that threatened their idyllic life. They were at minimum 1 month delinquent on their home loan installment payments, carrying a burdensome $10,000 in unpaid property taxes, and accumulating $22,000 in outstanding credit card balances from their lavish expenditures. These economic difficulties, following the arrival of her third child, a son named Drake, in October 1995, Darlie began manifesting clear indications of postpartum depression, a serious condition characterized by persistent sadness, anxiety, and fatigue that affects many new mothers. For a significant number of females, the manifestations of postpartum depression tend to subside relatively soon following delivery with proper support, but for certain others, these indications persist far longer and frequently go untreated or undiagnosed, owing to the societal taboo and stigma against openly discussing emotional struggles in recent parents, which deters many from seeking the professional help they desperately need. Regarding Darlie's specific situation, the indicators were escalating to a critical and dangerous level, manifesting in feelings of hopelessness and overwhelm. And on May 3rd, approximately 1 month preceding the fatal event that would change everything, she inscribed a deeply troubling and revealing entry in her personal journal that hinted at suicidal thoughts. Devon, Damon, and Drake, I hope you will forgive me for what I am about to do. My life has been such a hard fight for a long time, and I just can't find the strength to keep fighting anymore. I love you 3 more than anything else in this world, and I want all 3 of you to be healthy and happy, and I don't want you to see a miserable person every time you look at me. This raw and emotional passage from her journal has since undergone exhaustive analysis from various perspectives, scrutinized by both Darlie's legal representatives during her defense and the accusing side in the prosecution, who interpreted it as potential evidence of her mental state leading to the crimes. Irrespective of the diverse interpretations offered on this diary entry by experts and commentators, as days elapsed and following an emotional and heartfelt exchange with her partner Darren about her struggles, Darlie indicated a noticeable improvement in her condition, with several close observers noting her apparent return to her customary lively and upbeat demeanor that she was known for, though this hardly signified a complete resolution to her underlying challenges, as the symptoms of depression can linger or recur without treatment. The pair's economic situation continued to pose a major and pressing issue in their marriage, straining their relationship and they persisted in engaging in tense and difficult dialogues about their deteriorating monetary circumstances right up to the evening prior to the occurrence that would shatter their world forever. At present, the happenings of the evening preceding June 6, 1996, specifically on June 5th, have sparked intense discussions and debates, both within legal proceedings during the trial and in wider public and media circles, with conflicting accounts and interpretations. And although absolute certainty eludes everyone regarding the precise sequence of that fateful evening, the subsequent narrative draws primarily from the recollections and testimonies shared by Darren and Darlie Routier themselves. To establish the context more fully, Darren had departed the premises earlier that evening to transport Darlie's sibling back to her own residence after a family visit, leaving Darlie at home with the children. The elder children, Damon and Devon, excitedly carried their cozy bedding and blankets down to the family room to settle in and view some late-night television alongside their mother, Darlie, creating what seemed like a normal, relaxed family evening. Upon Darren's return home later that night, he settled comfortably beside Darlie on the plush living room sofa for a brief conversation about their day and ongoing concerns, prior to eventually ascending to the upper level of the house to retire for the night in their master bedroom, leaving Darlie and the two older boys downstairs where they had dozed off in front of the glowing television screen. Proceeding from this juncture, I will recite Darlie Routier's first-hand account of the evening her children met their tragic end, using her precise phrasing from her official statement and trial testimony, which has been dissected countless times for inconsistencies. I wake up and feel a pressure on me. I felt Damon press on my right shoulder and heard him cry. This made me really come awake and realized there was a man standing down at my feet walking away from me. I walked after him and heard glass breaking. I got halfway through the kitchen and turned back around to run and turn on the light. I ran back towards the utility room and realized there was a big white-handled knife lying on the floor. It was then that I realized I had blood all over me, and I grabbed the knife thinking he was in the garage, so I thought he might still be there, and I yelled for Darren. I ran back through the kitchen and realized the entire living area had blood all over everything. I put the knife on the counter and ran into the entrance, turned on a light and started screaming for Darren. I think I screamed twice and he ran out of the bedroom with his jeans on and no glasses and was yelling, "What is it? What is it?" I remember saying he cut them. He tried to kill me, my neck. He ran down the stairs and into the room where the boys were. I grabbed the phone and called 911. Darren started giving Devon CPR while I put a towel on my neck and a towel over Damon's back. I remember telling Damon to hang on, Mommy was there. I looked over at Darren and saw the glass table had been knocked halfway off, and the flower arrangement had been knocked over. I then stood up and turned around and saw glass all over the kitchen floor. I tried to glance over to see if anything was out of place, or if anything was missing. I was still on the phone with 911, and I don't recall what all was said because everything was happening so fast. I went back to Damon, and by then, he had stopped moving, and the police walked through the door. The paramedics came and tried to work on the children. Darren was screaming, "Who did this? Who did this?" And I started asking if my babies were dead. Darren was crying and said yes. After that, I just remember screaming and showing Darren my neck. Darren took me out to the front of the house, and by then Darren ran upstairs to make sure the baby was okay and then handed him to Karen. I remember them holding a towel on my neck and wrapping my arm, and then they put me in an ambulance. Darren got in, but they told him he needed to leave so they could take care of me. I remember we got to the hospital and then them telling me they were taking me to surgery. They took off my necklace and put me to sleep. This constituted the core sequence of happenings, as relayed to authorities by Darlie Routier in her initial statements, though later testimonies would reveal variations that prosecutors used to question her credibility. Subsequent to the assault, Darlie was transported urgently to Baylor University Medical Center to receive immediate treatment for her various gashes and injuries. Upon her admittance, a team of physicians concurred that given the potentially life-threatening characteristics of her throat injury, which was a deep slash, the most prudent and safest measure was to expedite her directly to the surgical suite for investigative procedures and exploratory surgery on her damages to assess any internal harm. Dr. Alejandro Santos, the primary surgeon who conducted this intricate operation, carefully documented her injuries in medical records as a 9-centimeter gash, situated in Zone 2 of the throat region, which had approached within a mere 2 millimeters of her vital carotid artery, potentially fatal if severed, alongside a cut on her right forearm that necessitated several sutures to close, and another laceration on her left upper arm or shoulder that required attention. Following the thorough cleansing, stitching, and management of the injuries under anesthesia, the investigative surgery concluded successfully, with Dr. Santos ultimately concluding the injuries to be superficial in nature, based on medical criteria. It merits emphasis at this point that the application of the descriptor superficial, as articulated in his detailed courtroom declaration during the trial, carries a specific clinical meaning as an injury that failed to penetrate beyond the platysma muscle in the throat region, representing the thin muscular layer just beneath the epidermis and adipose tissue, not implying the wounds were minor or self-inflicted as some misinterpreted. Consequently, this is the precise rationale he provided in his testimony for employing the term superficial in characterizing the injuries, distinguishing it from layperson understandings that might downplay the severity. As Darlie gradually recuperated within the sterile confines of the hospital over the next few days, the authorities from the Rowlett Police Department confronted one of the most ferocious, puzzling, and intricate slaying inquiries their agency had ever undertaken, requiring extensive resources and expertise. It required little time for the principal detective, Jimmy Patterson, a veteran investigator with years of experience, to recognize the complexity and request reinforcements, which materialized in the person of James Crone, a highly respected former crime scene specialist who had retired but was called in for his analytical skills, whose expert assessment of the location would fundamentally shape the direction of the entire inquiry and prosecution's case. The location in question was characterized by multiple witnesses as a deluge of blood and chaos, featuring upended furnishings like a coffee table, accumulations of blood scattered in pools across the dwelling's lower level, and the tragic remains of Devon still positioned lifeless on the family room flooring, a sight that haunted first responders. The initial action by the detectives involved identifying the probable access route employed by the alleged perpetrator, which was established as a lower-level window in the attached garage of the residence, the mesh covering of which displayed clear signs of being incised with a sharp blade, creating a hole large enough for entry. Nevertheless, during closer and more meticulous examination, the investigators grew increasingly perplexed upon observing that the window ledge retained a substantial coating of dust and debris, entirely untouched and undisturbed, suggesting no one had climbed through. Moreover, the bedding material and mulch positioned directly exterior to the window remained wholly undisturbed as well, devoid of any imprints from footsteps or signs of compression that would indicate passage. Acknowledging these glaring anomalies that contradicted the intruder theory, the detectives proceeded to scrutinize the remaining traces within the dwelling, particularly focusing on the instrument of the crime itself. The blade instrumental in the violence had been sourced directly from the Routier household's culinary knife block in the kitchen, and was discovered atop the countertop adjacent to the basin, still saturated with gore and dripping blood. It had been positioned there by Darlie personally, consistent with her remarks during the emergency call, where she mentioned picking it up, a detail that would later be used against her as evidence of tampering. Initially, the authorities presumed this constituted a heist or burglary that had escalated disastrously into violence, but this hypothesis was swiftly undermined and dismissed when they observed that proximate to the blade lay Darlie's valuable assortment of accessories, including gold rings and bracelets, abandoned completely unmolested on the surface, untouched by any would-be thief. Eliminating the theft incentive as a primary motive, the officials then meticulously traced the blood trail extending through the structure, analyzing patterns with forensic experts. Within the culinary space, a large reservoir of blood had pooled on the tiled flooring, with droplets and cast-offs spattered across the worktops near the basin and the storage units underneath. Yet the basin proper appeared immaculately free of any visible residue, raising immediate suspicions. The duo of forensic examiners who later assessed the site in detail remarked that the basin exhibited clear signs of having been recently purged of sanguineous material, as if someone had rinsed it clean. Indeed, subsequent luminol and chemical analysis revealed that both the basin and its fixture yielded positive results for residual blood traces that had been washed away, but not entirely eliminated. This implies that sanguineous fluid had occupied the basin at an earlier juncture during the incident, but had been opportunely eradicated prior to the authorities' arrival, suggesting an attempt to clean up evidence. This absence of blood was not confined to that single area, as the investigators navigated the premises pursuing the path of blood ostensibly deposited by the fleeing trespasser, only to find that the path abruptly ceased indoors with no continuation. Despite thorough examinations of dubious markings and stains detected outdoors in the yard and alley, no sanguineous residues were identified through testing. In reality, there existed no indication whatsoever beyond the confines of the home, suggesting the presence of an external perpetrator, such as footprints, dropped items, or blood drops leading away. The discrepancies and inconsistencies did not stop here, as police turned their attention to the specific area where the crime took place in the living room. Noticing something profoundly wrong with the arrangement, they observed a toppled vase atop the coffee table that had been thrown to its side, though strangely, neither the delicate glass atop the table nor the vase itself were shattered or broken in any way, which seemed odd for a violent struggle. A nearby wine rack had been pushed slightly, forcing a fragile wine glass to shatter onto the ground below. But, as investigators later noted in their reports, the broken pieces were laying directly on top of the trail of Darlie's blood droplets, suggesting the glass had broken after Darlie had already bled through the kitchen area during the alleged chase. The same peculiar pattern could be said of a vacuum cleaner that had supposedly been knocked over during the intense struggle with the intruder, yet investigators found bloody footprints and splatters underneath its base, along with a clear track mark in the blood, indicating it had been deliberately rolled to its spot after the blood was shed. To lead investigator Jimmy Patterson and the consulted expert James Cron, each of these mounting discrepancies could only point to one logical conclusion. The crime scene had been carefully staged to mimic an intrusion, and the killer must have originated from within the house itself, making this an inside job rather than a random attack. Once this pivotal determination was made by the investigative team, police worked quickly and methodically to put together their case against Darlie, collecting additional evidence in what they described as the most intensive and exhaustive investigation ever conducted by the Rowlett Police Department up to that point, involving forensic labs, interviews, and surveillance. Finally, on June 18, 1996, just 12 days after the murders, the Rowlett PD moved in decisively to make the arrest. News reports at the time stated, "John and Chip, evidence at the crime scene, told one story. Darlie Routier's account of that deadly night was a far cry different. Police say it was a vicious, planned attack in which the mother allegedly stabbed her children to death and spun a tale to cover it up." Authorities publicly declared, "We believe that the white male suspect described by Darlie Routier as the man that attacked her and murdered her children never existed." In response, Darlie's supporters protested, "Darlie is innocent. I feel that she has not done this. She would barely spank her children, let alone do this to them." Only 12 days after the devastating deaths of her children, Darlie Routier was formally arrested on 2 counts of capital murder, a charge that carried the possibility of the death penalty in Texas. News of her shocking arrest sent immediate shockwaves through the quiet town of Rowlett and far beyond into national headlines. A community that had once collectively mourned with her as a victim now stood stunned and divided, struggling to reconcile the sympathetic image of a grieving mother with that of an accused killer capable of such heinous acts. Neighbors who knew Darlie personally, whose kids had played at her house regularly, responded by posting handmade signs in their front yards professing her innocence and calling for justice. Her extended family and close friends rallied around her with unwavering support, certain that the woman they knew and loved could have never committed what the police claimed she had, organizing fundraisers and public statements. One supporter emphatically stated, "We would be very supportive of her. We're still going to love her as much as we do today, and I would trust my children in her care. Even if they say that they convinced her to say she was guilty, she would never hurt my children. Never." Although not everyone held this firm belief in her innocence, and as word rapidly spread about the 26-year-old Texas mother arrested for brutally murdering her own children in their home, the media outlets dug their claws deeply into the case, sensationalizing every detail. The story burned like wildfire across television networks and newspapers, and with it, Darlie's once positive reputation was systematically dismantled in the court of public opinion. Absolutely everything about her personal life was called into question and scrutinized relentlessly. Her bleached hair, her manicured nails, her figure after 3 pregnancies, the way she talked with a southern accent, the way she cried or didn't cry enough. All of it was deemed fair game to broadcast to the masses, often with biased commentary that painted her as vain or unmotherly. The character assassination had become so extreme and pervasive that many in the public were now derisively calling her the Texas Susan Smith, drawing direct comparisons. without solid evidence at first, to the infamous South Carolina mother, who had drowned both her young children by strapping them into their car seats and deliberately driving her vehicle into a lake to stage their deaths. Susan Smith had originally claimed that a black man had kidnapped her children during a carjacking incident, only for this fabricated story to have later been exposed as a complete lie designed to cover up her own crime and affair motives. The public outrage and media frenzy from that high-profile case heavily colored and influenced the public's immediate response to Darlie's arrest, indicting her as a cold-blooded killer long before her trial had even taken place or evidence was fully presented. But it wasn't just the way she looked or her lifestyle that fed the insatiable media fire and public disdain. At the core of the public's deep and visceral disdain for Darlie was a short, controversial video clip taken at Damon and Devon's gravesite, captured only a few days after the murder, specifically on the day that would have been Devon's 7th birthday. Footage showed, for some, this may seem a strange thing to do, in an odd place and time. Happy birthday, Devon. Singing happy birthday in a cemetery to a son who was brutally stabbed to death just over a week ago. Love you, Devon and Damon. But Darlie and Darren Routier say this is appropriate for them and their family. Helium balloons instead of headstones to remember Devon, who would have turned 7 today. In this short video, which was plastered repeatedly on the screen of every major news outlet in Texas and nationally, it showed Darlie and her sister engaging in what appeared to be celebratory behavior, spraying colorful silly string on the boy's fresh gravestone while singing happy birthday, in a seemingly lighthearted manner. In it, Darlie seems far from the image of a devastated, grieving mother that society expected her to be, instead smiling broadly, chewing gum casually, and appearing upbeat. When reporters at the scene pressed her about why she chose to celebrate them in this unconventional way at the gravesite, she explained calmly, "Because even though we're sad, because they were not here, we do what we can to get us through these times." This response, intended as a coping mechanism, only fueled further criticism. This was all the public and media needed to brand her unequivocally as a killer without remorse. Their minds were made up almost instantly, and now all that was left was proving it formally in court, as public sentiment turned overwhelmingly against her. Thus began one of the most closely watched and media-saturated trials in Texas history, the state of Texas versus Darlie Routier. Following the high-profile arrest, the small town of Rowlett was suddenly flush with news cameras and reporters from across the country. The case of the so-called killer mom became a hit story that dominated headlines across Texas and the nation, with thousands of viewers tuning in daily to find out more salacious details, as the public eagerly dissected every aspect of Darlie's life and past, consuming every minute detail from her fancy upscale home to her high-maintenance personal upkeep like breast implants and jewelry. Many of those following the case closely had already made up their minds about her guilt based on media portrayals. The town of Rowlett and the surrounding county of Dallas could no longer balance the immense weight of the public's intense scrutiny and preconceived notions, while still attempting to hold a fair and impartial trial with an unbiased jury pool. This is why, in September of 1996, Darlie's court-appointed lawyers filed a motion asking for her trial to be moved out of Dallas County to the nearby Kerr County because of the overwhelming pretrial publicity that had tainted potential jurors. However, this strategic motion has come under significant scrutiny and criticism in the years since, as some legal experts suggest that the decision to hold the trial in a smaller, more conservative rural town like Kerrville, which boasted one of the highest conviction rates in the state at the time, made it far more likely for the jury to favor the prosecution's narrative and deliver a guilty verdict. It was decisions like these, along with perceived inadequacies in representation, that ultimately led the Routier to dump their initial court-appointed attorney and make the bold move to mortgage their house to afford a big-shot defense lawyer named Doug Mulder, who was known as a formidable force to be reckoned with in Texas courtrooms, having a reputation for aggressive tactics. To supplement his legal work and build a stronger case, Darren also hired a private investigator, ex-FBI agent Lloyd Harrell, to delve deeper into what he believed the police had overlooked or mishandled in their rush to accuse Darlie. With this star-studded and very expensive defense team in place, the Routiers were hopeful that when they walked Darlie through the courthouse doors for opening statements, she would eventually walk back out as a free woman vindicated. Unfortunately, this optimistic outlook couldn't have been further from the truth, as the trial would unfold with intense drama and ultimately go against her. As the jury filed into the courtroom on January 6, 1997, in Kerrville, the court sat down to listen attentively to both sides' compelling opening statements, setting the tone for the proceedings. As per usual courtroom procedure, the prosecution delivered their statement first, with lead prosecutor Greg Davis presenting Darlie as a self-centered woman, a materialistic woman, and a woman cold enough, in fact, to murder her own 2 children, painting a picture of a narcissistic killer driven by financial desperation. The defense quickly followed with their own passionate plea to the jury to see Darlie not as a monster, but as an American mother, just like any other number of American mothers. Lawyer Doug Mulder continued to emphasize, "She's not perfect. Never said she was. Nobody is ever going to say she was. But the description of becoming a psychotic killer will not be borne out in the evidence. And when you have heard all of that, although you won't know what happened fully at 5801 Eagle, you will know that the evidence does not prove that Darlie Routier committed this crime." Now, the entire trial spanned multiple grueling weeks, with a final verdict being delivered almost a month later in early February, after days of intense deliberations. In this time, dozens of experts in forensics, officers from the scene, friends, family members, and medical professionals gave their testimonies under oath to either defend Darlie's character and story or to prove her a calculating killer, and with hundreds of pages of documents, court transcripts, exhibits, and evidence logs, it is impossible for us to cover every single piece of evidence investigated since then in exhaustive detail. But the main arguments presented by each side have been condensed and expanded here for clarity. Let's start at the beginning, with how the alleged killer gained entry into the home, a point of major contention. According to police reports and Darlie's account, the only evidence of forced entry was found in a window located in the utility room adjacent to the garage of the home, found with a sliced mesh screen, creating a hole large enough for a person to pass through comfortably. However, the prosecution had a markedly different idea and theory, and argued vehemently that Darlie had cut the screen herself as part of an elaborate staging to simulate a break-in and divert suspicion. They argued that, had an intruder really entered the home through this particular window, there would have been clear evidence of disturbances in the surrounding area, but upon detailed investigation, authorities found a thick layer of undisturbed dust still sitting on the windowsill with no smudges or handprints. Not only that, but a plot of mulch positioned to the right of the window also sat completely undisturbed, without any footprints or compression. Running through that mulch would have been the killer's quickest and most logical route of escape after leaving the scene, unless they deliberately went 12 feet out of their way to avoid it, which seemed improbable during a hasty getaway. Would the killer have really spent precious seconds avoiding a plot of mulch when he was escaping the scene of the crime in the dark? Crime scene expert James Cron didn't think so, and made that abundantly clear in his testimony in court, stating that the lack of disturbance indicated no entry or exit through that point. Not only this, but investigators also questioned why an intruder would cut the screen to begin with, when simply removing it entirely was the simplest and quietest option, as it was not secured tightly. But it wasn't just the area surrounding the window that raised red flags. Upon further investigation through the home, forensic experts found a microscopic fiber clinging to one of the knives in the kitchen's knife block. This fiber was made up of fiberglass rods and rubber dust, almost identical to the makeup of the window screen material. This meant, to the investigators at least, that the knife that was used to cut the window screen came from inside the Routier's own kitchen, pointing to internal staging. In their view, this strongly pointed to a staged break-in, one carried out not by an external intruder, but by Darlie herself, in an attempt to mislead police. Now, the evidence surrounding the window seemed pretty damning when described by the prosecution in court, but the defense had a different take and counters for each point. According to some defense experts, the undisturbed dust on the windowsill was easily explained by the fact that the window was low enough to the ground that an intruder could have passed through easily without having to touch or lean on the windowsill at all, perhaps stepping over it carefully. The defense even had a plausible explanation for the most damning piece of evidence, the single fiber on the knife. Fibers, by their very nature, are extremely small, lightweight, and easily transferred from one item to another through contact or air. Considering only one intact fiber was found on the knife, The defense attributed its discovery to the investigation's order of events and potential cross-contamination. When dusting for fingerprints at the scene, the investigators brushed the window screen area first. Then they moved on to the knife block in the kitchen, making it entirely possible that upon dusting the window for fingerprints, a loose fiber could have clung to the brush bristles and been inadvertently transferred to the knife block when it was dusted later on. Although this wasn't enough to completely absolve Darlie from suspicion, it was sufficient for many to cast reasonable doubt on the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. Throughout the trial, lawyer for the prosecution, Greg Davis, relied heavily on Darlie's alleged lack of emotion and inappropriate grieving to prove that she was a person capable of killing her own children, arguing she showed no genuine remorse. This argument was not a difficult one to make, as the media and news cameras had already captured Darlie's every move since her release from hospital and broadcasted it nationwide, allowing anyone to become an armchair expert on her behavior and judge her harshly. The allegations of emotionless or uncooperative behavior began the night her children were murdered, starting from the moment she made the frantic 911 call. Some critics called her uncooperative when the operator was trying to get vital information from her amid the chaos, as she repeated phrases instead of answering directly. Others also pointed out that she mentioned on the phone that when she picked up the knife from the floor, she got her fingerprints on it, saying, "I bet if we could have gotten the prints, maybe." The prosecution were quick to point to this as evidence of guilt, stating that rather than be solely concerned with the state of her dying children, she was instead preoccupied with fingerprint evidence that could incriminate her. But the emotionless allegations do not stop here, extending to her interactions with first responders. Even the first officer on the scene, Officer David Waddle, stated in his testimony that when he arrived, he found Darlie simply standing there in the room, not actively helping her sons. He claimed she did not comply when he told her multiple times to apply pressure on Damon's wounds to stem the bleeding. When asked whether he believed Darlie was in a mental state in which she could lend assistance to her kids, Officer Waddle said yes, stating, "Well, she appeared to know everything that was going on inside the house. She was real alert and able to tell me what had happened. I thought if she was worried about fingerprints on a knife, she could certainly take care of her kids." Even as paramedics were carrying Damon's body out of the home on a stretcher, he noted that Darlie never once asked if Damon was okay or inquired where they were taking him for treatment. At the hospital shortly after, several nurses who treated her testified that Darlie was speaking with a flat affect, appearing withdrawn, not overtly emotional, and showing little of the hysteria one might expect from a mother who just lost 2 children. But for the prosecution, and ultimately the jury, the nail in the coffin came down to the item that defined the case in the public eye, the infamous silly string video. The video had made the rounds from news channel to news channel, showing the elaborate setup from the colorful helium balloons to the festive banner, and a smiling, gum-chewing Darlie spraying silly string over the boy's headstone in what appeared to be joy. Some likened it to dancing on their graves, a phrase that stuck in media narratives. Although however visceral and strong the people's reaction was to the video, and the damning image the prosecution presented of Darlie as uncaring, the defense was quick to remind the jury that the descriptions given here were of a woman who had just witnessed her children being murdered in front of her. A woman who was likely deeply traumatized, in shock, and processing grief in her own way, perhaps through denial or forced positivity. Who were we, as outsiders, to pass harsh judgment on how we think she should have grieved or behaved in such unimaginable circumstances? Not only this, but the defense also brought in multiple witnesses who had interacted closely with Darlie after her children's deaths, who stated under oath that she was very clearly grieving when they saw her, often breaking down in tears. Karen White, Darlie's longtime neighbor, David Rogers, her pastor, Dana Godfrey, a close friend, Kara Byford, another acquaintance, and the list goes on, all claiming they watched Darlie grieve appropriately in private moments, sobbing uncontrollably at times. Although many skeptics refute these testimonies by pointing out that they all came from people who were already friends or supporters of Darlie's, and therefore were unlikely to testify against her or provide unbiased accounts. Although the defense did not only bring testimonies from Darlie's friends to counter the narrative, they also called into question the accuracy of the notes taken by the nurses at the hospital, where there are multiple documented instances in the medical records in which they noted that Darlie was crying, visibly upset, and very emotional during her stay, directly contradicting their originally given testimonies describing her flat affect and lack of emotion. As for their most damning piece of evidence, the silly string tape that outraged the public, Darlie's defense attorney has often been criticized in retrospect for not presenting a secret police recording of a somber memorial service held at the gravesite earlier that same day, which showed a different side of the family in prayer. When questioned about the recording in court, the police officers involved pleaded the Fifth Amendment to avoid self-incrimination, a decision many consider shocking to this day, as it revealed illegal surveillance without a warrant. Now, along with the physical evidence in the home and the analysis of her emotional state and behavior, the prosecution were now ready to call into question the evidence of guilt found on Darlie herself, her wounds, and how they were sustained. With both boys having been stabbed so violently and deeply that the knife went all the way through their small bodies in some instances, why was it that Darlie's wounds were considered superficial by some medical standards? Why wouldn't the supposed killer exert the same brutal force towards killing Darlie herself if the intent was to eliminate witnesses? According to the prosecution's theory, this is because there was no killer at all. No intruder existed, and Darlie fabricated the story. The story the state presents is that Darlie, after stabbing and killing both her boys in a premeditated act, then turns the knife on herself, not to kill, but to maim just enough to make the police believe she was also a victim of the attack. Their evidence is as follows, built on forensic analysis. The first main point made by the prosecution was the relative severity of Darlie's cuts compared to the boys. The surgeon treating Darlie upon her arrival at the hospital described her injuries as superficial in medical terms, and inconsistent with other defensive wounds he had seen in his extensive career treating trauma victims. Apart from her visible injuries that were the main focus the night of the murders, such as the neck slash, Darlie also was found to have severe and extensive bruising on both of her arms, but these bruises were not documented or noted during her initial hospital visit, because according to the attending nurses' testimonies, they were simply never there at the time. Multiple nurses who treated Darlie the morning of June 6th stated during their testimonies that the bruising that was later photographed on Darlie's arms were not present during her initial examination and treatment at the hospital, and Darlie showed no signs of pain, swelling, or discomfort in those areas when examined. The bruises only appeared mysteriously after she left the hospital and returned home, leading many to claim that Darlie inflicted these bruises on herself deliberately after she came home from the hospital to further bolster her story of being attacked and struggling with an intruder. But it wasn't just the nature and timing of the injuries, but where and how they took place that was also reason for suspicion and scrutiny. Darlie, in all of her various testimonies and police interviews, was never entirely clear or consistent exactly where and when her injuries occurred during the alleged confrontation. In one interview, she stated, "I know I didn't sleep through that. I mean, how would anybody sleep through something like that?" But when pressed, "But yet you say you don't remember." "But I don't remember." "Can you imagine waking up out of your sleep with a man attacking you? What do you think happened then if you can't remember, but you don't think you slept through it?" "I think that I tried to fight with a man, and I think that he either knocked me unconscious, or I think that when, he slit my throat or whatever, I think I passed out." The prosecution uses this lack of certainty and varying recollections to provide their own alternate theory, which was that after the murder of the boys, Darlie stood over the kitchen sink and used the knife to cut her own neck and arm to self-inflict her own injuries as part of the staging. Evidence for this theory included the blood splatters found on the counter by the sink, the pool of blood in front of the sink on the floor, and the suspiciously cleaned-up blood traces in the sink itself, detected by luminol. Along with this, according to blood spatter experts like Tom Bevel, the blood splatters found on the kitchen floor were indicative of someone standing still in one place, rather than someone in rapid movement, say chasing after a fleeing killer through the house, as Darlie claimed to be doing in her account. Although, the defense, on the other hand, had their own respected expert to counter this. Dr. Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner for Bexar County and a renowned forensic pathologist, testified for the defense during the trial and stated that not only were Darlie's injuries consistent with those received in self-defense during a struggle, but also were very unlikely to have been self-inflicted due to their nature. According to him, the neck wound specifically was concerning and dangerous, as not only did it come dangerously close to her carotid artery, within 2 millimeters, which is an unlikely risk for someone to take when self-inflicting wounds intentionally, but both major wounds, the one on her arm and shoulder, were both found on the right side of her body. Darlie is right-handed, meaning that both these wounds had to have been made by her non-dominant left hand if self-inflicted, which would be awkward. She still could have inflicted the injuries with her right hand, but the angle would have been very imprecise, uncomfortable, and risky, and it is extremely unlikely that she would take that life-threatening risk on her own neck. In terms of the bruising on her arms, the defense called up a number of witnesses, including Kara Byford, a close friend of Darlie's, who claimed she distinctly remembered seeing the bruising on Darlie's arms when she visited her in the hospital room shortly after admission. The defense's medical expert, Dr. Vincent DeMaio, also stated that upon his examination of the photos of her bruising and its colorations, the bruises present on Darlie's arms could definitely have been inflicted the night of June 6 during the attack, and are consistent with defensive wounds received during a physical struggle, such as grabbing or blocking. One of the first concerns police had, and the origin of their suspicion towards Darlie from the outset, was the many inconsistencies they found in her story as it evolved over interviews. There were numerous instances in which Darlie changed her story, contradicted herself on key details, and altered points of the events of the night, which prosecutors highlighted as lies. Firstly, throughout the many testimonies and interrogations Darlie underwent, her account of events, including her description of the killer's appearance and actions, are constantly changing and vague. In her initial statement to police, she claimed she saw the intruder walking away from her and chased him out through the kitchen. In later versions during trial, she said she awoke to him on top of her and fought him off on the sofa before he fled. She never clearly clarified where exactly the struggle occurred, or how she sustained each wound, casting doubt on whether it happened at all. These inconsistencies led prosecutors to question what they termed her selective amnesia, implying she was fabricating details to fit the evidence. Furthermore, on the night of the murder, Darlie said she chose to sleep in the living room downstairs because baby Drake's movements in the crib would usually wake her up if she was upstairs, preferring the couch. If this is true, many question how she could then sleep through the brutal stabbings of 2 of her children just feet away undisturbed, without hearing their cries or struggles. The inconsistencies did not stop here, as one of the main ones was the issue of the damage found at the scene and its timing. Upon entry, police noted a glass-top coffee table, with the glass top remaining unbroken despite being knocked askew. There was a vase of flowers toppled over, and a lamp askew, but neither item was severely damaged or shattered, which seemed minimal for a life-or-death fight. During the alleged struggle, a wine rack was apparently pushed, breaking a glass on the floor, and a vacuum cleaner was tipped over in the kitchen area. However, blood was found beneath both items, not on top of them. If Darlie had been bleeding and chasing the attacker as she claimed, there should have been her blood on top as well, dripping after the items fell. Investigators also noted blood streaks and wheel marks, suggesting the vacuum was rolled into place deliberately, leading to the claim that these items were staged after the fact, and not during the heat of the attack, as part of a natural struggle. The prosecution used all of this evidence to posit the theory that Darlie, after killing her children in a moment of rage or calculation, staged the crime scene meticulously before calling 911 to pin the murder on a mystery intruder, one she couldn't even consistently describe to police in terms of height, build, or clothing. This was a bold and difficult claim to rebuke entirely, but the defense had a plan, and their own experts to challenge it. With their own expert, a former FBI investigator named Lloyd Harrell, they investigated the claims of staging, and stated that Darlie's testimony was not indicative of someone who had staged the crime scene intentionally. He referred to the way she described the events of the night in her statements, and the fact that she did not bring up the damaged items like the vacuum or wine glass until specifically asked about it by police during questioning. He explained that people who stage crime scenes usually mention the staged items right away in their accounts, to make sure their efforts aren't overlooked by investigators. As for the changes in her story over time, the defense called a forensic psychologist who had examined Darlie for hours after the murders and testified that Darlie was likely experiencing traumatic amnesia, a common condition that causes a person who has undergone a severe traumatic event to forget or repress certain parts of their memory of the event, explaining her changing and incomplete story. Aside from this psychological explanation, the defense also called into question the reliability of the police's notes and documentation from the night, specifically, whether they even took accurate notes at all during the chaos. Upon cross-examination, Attorney Doug Mulder questioned various officers who were on the scene the night of the murder, and found that very few of them were taking detailed notes on their findings or Darlie's statements. The questioning had even become so repetitive and revealing of lapses that the judge had to intervene and shut it down, stating, "I think it has been made abundantly clear that the gentleman was not taking notes." But the most significant and detrimental piece of evidence that supported the arguments of the defense was the presence of a single bloody sock, found 75 yards down the road in an alley from the Routier home. On this sock, which matched others from the Routier laundry room, investigators found the blood of both Damon and Devon Routier through DNA testing. This finding casts a huge wrench in the prosecution's arguments because it calls into question the entire timeline of events. According to the state's theory, after killing her children, Darlie inflicted her own superficial injuries, staged the scene by breaking items and cutting the screen, then called 911 and stayed on the line until police and first responders arrived at her home. But with the added evidence of the sock's location, the entire timeline falls apart and becomes implausible. According to medical experts, including the pathologist, after being stabbed with such severity, Damon could have only survived at most 9 minutes with his injuries before he died from blood loss and organ failure. If we start the clock from the moment Damon was stabbed and we end with his death at most 9 minutes later, 6 of those minutes can be accounted for with the recorded 911 call duration, and paramedics arrived within a minute after the call ended, finding Damon still barely alive and breathing. Taking all of this into account, Darlie would only have had at most 2 minutes to get both boys' blood on the sock somehow, run 75 yards down the dark street without being seen, drop the sock in the alley, run 75 yards back to the house without leaving blood trails outside, injure herself over the sink, stage the crime scene with the vacuum and glass, clean up traces, and then compose herself to call 911. For reference, 75 yards is 3/4 the length of a football field, a significant distance to cover twice in under 2 minutes while injured. This would be almost impossible physically, especially considering no blood was found along the path. For many supporters and even some jurors later, this singular sock became the piece of evidence that held up Darlie's innocence claim, and there was little the prosecutors could do to dispel the issue of the timeline convincingly, though they suggested she planted it earlier. But one of the main questions that still remained in the minds of many jurors and the public was the issue of a motive. Why would she do it? Darlie was well liked in her community, known as a kind, caring mother, and a supportive neighbor who hosted playdates. How could someone like this be capable of killing her own children so brutally? The prosecution's answer to this question came down to what many would consider outright character assassination to tarnish her image. To counter the positive portrayal of the quintessential American mother, the state instead painted a different, darker picture, one of a selfish, narcissistic woman who cared only for herself, her appearance and material possessions above all else. During closing arguments, several times this morning, prosecutor Greg Davis approached Routier, pointed at her, and said she killed her sons. The last time he did, she responded by calling him a liar. Leaning heavily into the media's coverage of the family's extravagant living, many posited the theory that their mounting financial troubles, expensive lifestyle choices, and Darlie's untreated postpartum depression all came together in a perfect storm to push her to kill her children for the life insurance money they would gain in their deaths, alleviating debts. Children are costly. Children demand attention. Children demand money. And if you eliminate those children, you eliminate those needs and those demands of the children. Although many people, including defense attorneys, were quick to see the faults and holes in this theory, pointing first to the fact that if Darlie wanted to kill the source of her stress and financial burden, why only kill the 2 older boys who were more independent, and not the infant Drake who required the most amount of attention, care, and expense as a baby? Not only this, but the life insurance policies for each boy would have only paid out a meager $5,000 per child, meaning the total payout for this brutal double murder would not even be enough to cover the boys' funeral expenses, let alone resolve their $22,000 credit debt or back taxes. If she really was in it for the money as a cold calculation, why not kill Darren instead, whose life insurance policy payout was a substantial $800,000, more than enough for her and the children to live comfortably without him? Regardless of the holes in the motive argument, under Texas law, the prosecution does not need to prove a definitive motive to convict someone. Only evidence that proves beyond reasonable doubt that Darlie committed the crimes. And for the jury in Kerrville, they had heard enough to reach their decision. We're very optimistic. We think that, after the arguments, the jury considers all the evidence, that they'll do the right thing. I feel great about the case. I think we did exactly what we set out to do, and that is, we've proved beyond any reasonable doubt this woman is guilty of killing her 2 children. Routier's family has been seen with their heads bowed around the courthouse, but they say it's not because of defeat. We're praying. That's not a look of beaten. People put their heads down doesn't mean they're beaten. No, we're not beaten until this is over. Started telling Darlie yesterday and today that she should prepare herself for a death sentence because I thought the handwriting was on the wall, and that she should be prepared for it. After a month of intense testimonies from medical experts, friends, family, investigators, and forensic analysts, on February 1st, 1997, the jury passed down a guilty verdict after deliberating for several hours. Darlie Routier would be convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection, a penalty that shocked many but satisfied others. Devastated by the outcome, Darlie's family did what they could to attempt to appeal the decision and seek a retrial. Hoping for a reversal, the defense argued that the court transcripts compiled by stenographer Sandra Halsey were inaccurate and contained errors, but the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected their objection and upheld the conviction despite the controversies. With years' worth of new evidence emerging, including advanced forensic techniques unavailable in 1997 and changes in how the case is presented by innocence advocates, some have even changed their initial opinions on her guilt. Most notably, one jury member who served in the original trial has now publicly stated they regret their decision to pass down a guilty verdict and would not support this decision given the additional information they have now about mishandled evidence. Barbara Davis, the author of Precious Angels, a book detailing Darlie's murder case and heavily supporting her guilty verdict at the time, has now come out stating she has completely changed her mind after re-examining facts and no longer believes that Darlie received a fair trial and that she may not be guilty at all based on overlooked evidence. In the nearly 3 decades following her highly publicized trial and sentencing, Darlie's case has become infamous and a staple in true crime discussions, with entire books, documentaries, podcasts, and online archives dedicated to proving either her innocence or her guilt through reanalysis. The case became a moral battleground for debates on women's rights, media influence, and capital punishment. And with the vast amount of information surrounding it, it's almost impossible to be absolutely sure of the truth without doubt. Even in this video, there was much we were still not able to cover in full depth, such as the detailed bloodstain pattern analysis by Tom Bevel, Darren's alleged attempted insurance fraud plan prior to the murders, the mysterious black car reportedly seen on Darlie's street the night of the murders by witnesses, or the controversies around an unidentified bloody fingerprint found in 2002 that didn't match the family but was inconclusive. All of these could not be covered exhaustively because ultimately, in the end, they did not change the legal outcome of the case, though they fuel ongoing appeals. Darlie was convicted of capital murder for Damon's death, though charged for both, and to this day in 2025, sits on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, awaiting further DNA results that could potentially exonerate her. Whether she deserves it or not remains a hotly debated question.